Hello, this is Professor Wergeles. We're recording a video on the database with PHP lecture. In the previous lectures, we connected to our database using PHP. We looked at what MySQL is. We studied SQL, and now we are on class 27. In the previous video, we actually started on class 27 by connecting our PHP to MySQL. If you don't have this zip, go ahead and download the zip and unzip it and then put it on your server. We'll be starting in the second directory. If you go back to this video here, PHP connect to MySQL, that's in the first directory. Today we'll be starting in the second directory, and we'll start in login.php. Now this code you will have seen before. If you look at this code, it's actually our user authentication lecture, where we started a session, we checked whether the user was logged in. If they're logged in, we redirect them to page 1. If they're not, we make sure that the action is equal to do login. That's the hidden variable. If it is, we grab the username and password from the form, and then before we hard-coded that and checked it to a hard-coded string, which is test and pass. Now, test and pass is a required user and password for the final project. So we'll do the same, except in this challenge, we're going to connect to the database and check the username and password. So we'll also need to use MySQL Workbench. Let me open that up. Okay, after you get MySQL Workbench open, remember every time we use MySQL, we need to select the database. Okay, so if I select the database, I need to use the use command. So I'll do use CS2830, that's the database we made last class. And we can show the tables. Now, before I connect to this with PHP to do the login, before I can check the username and password, we may need to create a users table. So I do show tables. You'll see the food stock table. That's what we created in the previous lecture. We're going to create a new table today. So we're going to use the create table command. The table is going to be called users. And we'll probably want an ID. This is going to be an int, which is going to be our primary key. Now, the primary key is usually recommended to an auto increment. Okay, if I do an auto increment, the database will handle this for us. Okay, so increment, it'll start at 1 and go to 2, 3, 4, and it'll just keep auto incrementing by itself. We'll also probably want to store a username. Now, the username, we want to make sure it's unique. So it must be a varchar. So let's say the username must be 255 characters or less. It can also not be null, and it must be unique. Okay, in order for me to check for uniqueness, I must use a varchar. Now for the password, let's call it user password. I believe password's a keyword. So if I just put password, that's actually a keyword. So we want to avoid using keywords. So if I do user password, you see it doesn't turn blue. I can use this. I'm going to use this as text, and it's not null. So they must require a username and a user password in order to create a record in the users table. Now, password, we don't need to check with any of the other passwords, so it can just be a text. Now, remember, for text, it's dynamic. So if I store 1 character, it'll only take 1 character's space. If I store 300 characters, it'll take 300 characters space. For varchar, no matter what, it's always going to be 255. So if I store 1 character, it'll be 255. If I store 20 characters, it'll be 255. That's why I can check for uniqueness. If I try to check for uniqueness here, I'm surprised it's not giving me an error. Let's see if it gives me an error. Okay, it gives me an error. It says, a column user password in the key specify without a key link. Okay, so I'm trying to check for uniqueness, but text has no link, so I cannot check for uniqueness there. So the student had a question in the class. They said, well, what about when we need to check the password? Well, if I check 1 row, so if I check the password with some text, it'll work. But MySQL can't check all the rows for uniqueness. For username here, they're all linked 255, so I can check for uniqueness between all the rows. For text, I'm not able to do this. But for the password, that's fine because we don't care if they have the same password as another user. We'll also do something like add date, which will be a date time, and also modify date, which will be a date time. So we can keep track of when we added the user and if we ever modified the user. Now this database, this table is a basic table with basic constraints, and it may be a better way to do it. But I recommend first getting the login to work. After you get the login to work, you can then go back and fix up the table and add more constraints and make a better structure for the table. We'll also need to insert a user. Now for the final project requirements, we require one user to have at least the username as test and the password as pass. That way the TAs can grade your final project. So we'll do that here. I'll put a username, I'll put a user password, I'll add the add date and the modify date. Now remember, I don't need to add the ID because we're using auto increment, and the IDs field will be added for us. So here I'm going to add test, I'm also going to add pass, the add date is now, the modify date is also now. When we add passwords, we're just adding it as plain text. Now this is not recommended, but we are doing our first prototype. So I recommend you keep it simple. Just do plain text. Let's get the login to work. Then we can go back and encrypt passwords. Okay, so make sure you run this create statement. It's a green, so it was successful. I'm also going to run this insert command. Now I have my first user, so let's see what's wrong. User password field. User password, okay, I'm missing an S. Try to run it again. Okay, it went through. So now I can do a select star from users and see what kind of data we have in the database. Okay, so here it is. So now I can program my login to grab this username and password and let the user log in. Okay, we'll come back to this table structure. Also in the next video, we will connect the PHP and successfully implement the login. Continue to the next video to continue this lecture.